Masks fall where your naivety ends. Have you ever wondered how many times your forgiveness saved someone else but destroyed you? What if your empathy were not a virtue, but a carefully built trap? What if you were actually the main person responsible for the mask others wear in front of you? Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But what happens when we stop forgiving and start looking? Most of us learned as children that to be loved, we had to be good, that being good meant yielding, that loving meant accepting, and that forgiving was the same as strength. But there is a very thin line between compassion and self-abandonment, between being empathetic and becoming an accomplice to your own destruction. Imagine this. You are facing the person who has hurt you the most. Once again, they ask for forgiveness with that same rehearsed tone, that same damp look of calculated guilt. You smile, you say it is all right, that you understand, that you forgive, but this time something in you does not agree. A subtle discomfort, an inner noise, a primitive force whispering, "No more." That moment is the start of a quiet revolution. Jung called it the encounter with the shadow, the instant when everything you swallowed for years starts rising in your throat, when forgiveness tastes like blood and empathy turns to nausea. This is not about stopping being good. It is about refusing to be held hostage by goodness. It is about looking in the mirror and seeing, perhaps for the first time, the mask you put on yourself, the tireless empath, the eternal peacemaker, the gentle soul that is screaming inside. Here the true path begins, a journey between what we were taught to be and who we are when we strip off every layer. Get ready, because when the empath stops forgiving, all masks fall, every single one, including yours. As a child, you learn to read the room like someone walking barefoot across a floor strewn with broken glass. A crooked glance, a harsher tone of voice, a door slammed shut. All of it was a warning, and before you even knew why, you reshaped yourself, softened your body, moderated your voice, smiled to calm the world. Because deep down, being loved was never guaranteed. It was a prize for good behavior. And in that invisible survival stage, forgiveness became your favorite act. But here is an uncomfortable truth. Not all forgiveness is born of love. Much of it sprouts from fear, from the desperate need to keep bonds intact. Even when those bonds are crushing you, you do not forgive because you believe the other deserves it. You forgive because you cannot bear the idea of losing them. Carl Jung called this a perversion of empathy, when compassion stops being a free act and becomes a defense mechanism, a shield against rejection, a denial of your own instinct for self-protection. Look, the empath is, at bottom, a survivor, and that is why so many of us, maybe you too, built that charming mask called the good person, a costume that says, "I understand you, I accept you, I forgive you," even while inside we are exhausted, wounded, silently screaming. And the more we wear that mask, the more the world applauds us. How understanding you are, how enlightened, how evolved. But the truth, the real truth, is that so often the goodness people celebrate in you is nothing but fear dressed up as nobility. Fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear of being seen as bad. So you forgive what should never be tolerated. You smile when you really want to scream. You bare your chest to someone who only ever shows up with a knife in their hand. Jung said that when we reject the dark aspects of ourselves, anger, indignation, healthy selfishness, we end up projecting them onto others. But what if I told you that this excessive goodness, this endless forgiveness, this drive to always be understanding is actually your shadow dressed as light? It hurts to admit it, but the empath manipulates too. Not with harsh words, but with sweet gestures, not with control, but with concessions. The empath manipulates when they erase themselves so the other will stay, then silently demand reciprocity they never clearly asked for. And it is in that vicious cycle that the prison is born. You are hurt, you forgive, you erase yourself. You wait for recognition, it never comes. You suffer in silence, and then you forgive again. That is the mask of compassion, so refined that even you forget you are wearing it. But it is heavy, and one day it starts to crack. That day could be today. It can arrive as exhaustion. It can arrive as an unexpected burst of anger. It can arrive as that quiet sense that no one really sees you. And when that happens, you get scared because behind the mask you find something you were taught to reject. Your survival instinct. The part of you that knows when you are being used. The part of you that feels anger and is right to feel it. The part of you that wants to say enough. But how do you say enough when your entire identity was built on yes? This is where Jung offers a way out, a hard way, yes, but a real one. He calls it individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, integrating light and shadow, pain and desire, acceptance and limits. And that process almost always begins when the empath refuses to keep forgiving automatically. When they finally see that forgiveness cannot be a rule but a choice, and that it is unworthy to offer forgiveness as alms when your own heart is bleeding. From here, something changes. You stop saying yes on autopilot. You stop saving those who do not want to be saved, and you begin, little by little, to choose yourself. That is the first revolution. Realizing your goodness no longer has to be a shield. It can be truth, but a truth with boundaries. A truth that does not bend. A truth that loves without destroying itself. Breathe. We are only just beginning. If this hurt, it is because something in you is waking up. Now tell me something. Have you ever felt that you give too much and still you are not respected? It is not for lack of effort. It is because respect is not begged for. It is projected. And that projection begins with how you train your mind to keep cool and focused in critical moments. Many grew up with the idea of being good, being understanding, but that does not forge strong people. It forges people who are easy to manipulate. There is a model of mental self-control being used by those who chose to stop pleasing and start imposing themselves with presence. We recorded a video explaining how that structure works in real life. To access it, scan the code on the screen or click the link in the description or the first pinned comment. Have you ever pretended to be fine so as not to scare someone? Swallowed sharp words, masked discomfort with a smile, and slipped out of the scene like smoke, just to keep the peace. Most empaths have done it so many times it became a reflex. You sense the atmosphere shift and you shift too. You feel the tension and you give in. You notice the disrespect and you swallow it. But the day comes when silence stops being a refuge and becomes captivity. Carl Jung called persona that social role we adopt to be accepted. It is the mask we put on to fit in, to be loved, to avoid conflict. And for the empath, that persona has a very specific signature, the eternal understanding one, the person who always understands the other but is rarely understood, who always listens but is almost never heard, who is always emotionally available, yet inside is emotionally starving. Outwardly, you are the hug. Inside, you are the echo of a soundless scream. You learn that showing discomfort can drive people away, that setting boundaries can seem aggressive, that your pain is not a priority, because there is always someone more hurt, more needy, more vulnerable. So you pull back, you go quiet, you endure. But that silence is not neutral. It piles up like dust from unspoken feelings, like rust on the bones of the soul, like the accumulation of everything you wanted to express, but could not. And then one day the body starts speaking for you. Anxiety appears for no obvious reason. The fatigue does not leave. Autoimmune illnesses knock at the door as if to say, If you will not defend yourself, I will. Jung did not see suffering as something to be eliminated immediately. For him, pain was a signal, the soul's call for truth. And the truth here is simple and brutal. The persona is collapsing. You can no longer pretend. Words get stuck. Tears come without explanation. You try to smile and feel fake. You try to yield and feel rage. It is as if something inside you says, I will not cooperate with this charade anymore. That collapse is scary because it threatens the image others have of you. And even more painfully, it threatens the image you build of yourself. You were always the strong one, the sensitive one, the steady one. And suddenly you are on the verge of an outburst or holed up in a dark room, unable to explain why you are so exhausted. This is the beginning of deconstruction. It is your old self dying. Jung said the birth of the true self only happens after the death of the persona. As if, in order to be reborn, you had to let your reputation as a good person burn. Let others think you lost your mind. Stop being who you always were to become who had always been waiting. You stop saying yes through clenched teeth. You stop going where you do not want to be. You stop smiling when you are in pieces. You say no for the first time, and you hear the sound of the world cracking. Some people step away, others get angry, some call you selfish, cold, changed. But inside you feel a strange relief, a melancholic lightness, like someone who finally carries their own body without dragging it. Silence now has another function. It is no longer fear, it is presence, inner listening. You start asking yourself, what do I truly want? What am I enduring only because I am afraid to disappoint? With whom am I really myself? And perhaps for the first time you do not have all the answers, but that does not panic you, because now the emptiness is no longer the end. It is the fertile ground where truth begins to grow. And so the collapse of the persona reveals itself as liberation, because the empath who stops pretending stops being a walking fantasy and becomes human. Imperfect, full of flaws, full of conflicting emotions, but also full of truth, soul, life. You look in the mirror and for the first time you do not see an idealized version of you. You see someone real with anger, with desire, with pain, with boundaries. And that is sacred. As Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And no one becomes real without disappointing the world first. There is a kind of anger that does not destroy. It does not shout. It does not smash glasses. It does not make headlines. It is born slowly, quiet like a prayer in reverse, intense like an ancient secret finally revealed. It is the anger of the awakened empath, not an explosive fury that wounds, but a steady flame that burns down everything that was false. It is the anger of someone who spent a lifetime accepting the unacceptable in the name of love, of someone who always said yes to preserve relationships that were never reciprocal, of someone who finally says, "This is where I stop." Carl Jung did not fear anger. For him, shadow emotions were not enemies, but messengers. There is no awakening without pain, he wrote. And the pain of anger, hot, shamed, smothered, is one of the most urgent to hear. But here is the problem. Empaths were trained to fear emotion. They learned that feeling anger is being negative, that anger proves spiritual backwardness, that a good heart must always be at peace, even if it costs them their sanity. And so anger became a monster hidden in the basement of the soul, except it was never the villain. It was always the alarm. Anger is the emotional defense system that activates when there is an invasion. It is not saying attack. It is saying protect yourself. It is not saying shout. It is saying wake up. And when the empath starts listening to that anger, something deep moves. You begin to remember the boundaries you ignored, the times you sensed the abuse and stayed quiet, the wounds that healed crooked because you were too busy healing everyone else's. That anger is a ritual, a baptism of fire that burns away the character of the eternally understanding to reveal the human who knows how to say no. And that no is more powerful than any scream. It does not need justification. It does not need to be understood. It just needs to be felt as truth. But be prepared, people will notice. The first time you set a boundary, you look cruel. You say, "I cannot help you with that right now." And the other person responds with theatrical disappointment. You refuse to step into yet another crisis that is not yours, and you hear, "Wow, how you have changed." You step back from someone who drains you, and they call you cold. But inside, a new silence appears. A silence that does not choke, that embraces. You start to realize you never needed to carry so much, that many of the weights you called love were only emotional addictions. And then anger transmutes. It stops being rebellion and becomes a compass. It shows you where the other ends and where finally you begin. You learn to say no without guilt, to cut ties without resentment, to walk away without over-explaining, to let others feel the weight of their own decisions without you serving as the emotional cushion. Jung called this the integration of the warrior archetype. It is when the empath stops being only a healer and becomes a guardian of themselves. It is when the heart opens but no longer bleeds for just anyone. And something almost magical happens. You start attracting different people, those who respect your space, who do not invade your time, who do not use vulnerability as currency. People who understand that love does not demand the sacrifice of identity. You see that true bonds do not require you to dim yourself. They flourish where there is light and shadow, where there is reciprocity, where there is truth. And maybe for the first time, you feel proud of your anger, not because it makes you better than anyone, but because it gave you back to yourself. As Jung said, what you resist persists, but what you accept transforms. Accepting your anger does not make you a monster. It makes you whole. It makes you human. It makes you free. Sacred anger is that, the invisible border between who you were when you beg for permission to exist and who you become when you refuse to live by halves. You start saying no. You start leaving earlier. You start keeping quiet where before you explained everything. You start turning down invitations loaded with expectations. You start setting limits for those who always treated you like an all-you-can-eat emotional buffet. And then something starts happening. One by one, the faces around you begin to change. Some disappear, others complain, some take offense, others accuse you. You are not the same anymore. And you hear that with a mix of pain and relief, because finally it is true. You are not the same. Carl Jung knew that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, inevitably disorganizes the structures around you. He said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But if only one is willing to change, the other withdraws or attacks." That is exactly what happens when the empath stops erasing themselves. The dynamic changes and every system built on your compliance starts to crumble. That friendship that only existed when you listened for hours without being heard. That family member who called only to ask for favors. That relationship where affection always arrived after your sacrifice. All of it now feels strange, as if by changing the lens, you can finally see the script of the play you were performing and realize it was not love, it was convenience. You begin to spot the roles. The chronic victim who sought you only to lament. The energy vampire who fed on your attention. The kindly manipulator who always knew how to turn the blame back on you. Those masks now begin to fall. And it is not that you became colder or smarter. It is that you are less available to stay blind. Clarity hurts, yes, because along with the fall of others' masks, yours falls too. The mask of the silent victim, the mask of the emotional martyr, the mask of the good person who was loved for never making waves. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow, When what we reject in ourselves finally demands to be seen. And in that confrontation, you understand, you also played a part. You also manipulated, even if without malice. You also kept relationships going by self-erasing. You yielded to avoid being abandoned, and by yielding, you built your own cage. But listen, recognizing that is not blaming yourself, it is freeing yourself. It is finally taking the reins of your story. Then comes the most painful and pure part, the natural selection of relationships. Some people will leave without drama, without a fight. They will simply disappear. Others will scold you, try to manipulate your guilt, awaken your old script. They will say you have changed too much, that you are selfish, cold, difficult. But there are also those who stay, and they are worth gold. They are the ones who celebrate your clarity, who accept your no without feeling rejected, who adjust to the new space between you with respect. They are those who loved you all along, even when you were not dimming yourself for them. It is in those few, those rare ones, that true connection is born. The bond that survives the end of mass. The relationship that does not need your pain as currency. The love that respects your existence without demanding you break into pieces. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. But when you begin to face yours, you become a mirror. And not everyone wants to see themselves reflected so clearly. You become a dangerous mirror because you reflect what the other is trying to hide from themselves. Because your lucidity demands authenticity, and authenticity has a price. There is no longer room for emotional games. This is the great unmasking, where only those remain who know how to walk beside a waking soul without trying to dim it again. And you? Are you ready to lose what was never real? Are you ready to gain what exists only in truth? If so, keep going." The next passage is deep. Let us talk about what comes after the mass fall, when the empath finally stops forgiving by habit and begins to forgive with consciousness. A moment arrives when you look at everything you have lived, every swallowed silence, every tear shed in secret, every "I am fine" spoken through clenched teeth, and you feel something new, unfamiliar, almost strange. You are not angry, but you are not willing to repeat any of it. This is where the empath finally finds a new form of forgiveness, no longer as anesthesia, no longer as currency, no longer as emotional addiction, but as a conscious act, intimate and deep, not to save the other, but to rescue yourself. Carl Jung wrote, "True forgiveness does not suppress a justified reaction. It honors the wound even as it releases resentment." And perhaps this is the most important point. You no longer need to deny your pain to release the other. You no longer need to pretend everything is fine to prove you have evolved. Because spiritual evolution, the real embodied kind, does not happen on an altar of purity. It is built in the mud of the soul, amid stumbles, boundaries, courage, anger, and hard decisions. Understand that forgiving is not forgetting. It is not justifying the other, much less opening your arms as if nothing happened. It is remembering and still deciding not to carry that weight anymore. It is saying, "Yes, you hurt me. Yes, I abandoned myself for you. But now I choose to break this cycle." And that choice is not quick. It comes after mourning, after fury, after loneliness, after doubt, after inner rebuilding. Conscious forgiveness is not immediate. It is an honest outcome. It does not occur right after the trauma because it first requires restoring your own integrity. Jung called this the process of individuation, when a person stops trying to please the world and starts aligning with their own soul. And that means forgiveness now has criteria. It is offered with discernment. It demands truth before reconciliation. It no longer serves to maintain bonds, but to release the ties that were choking you. You start to notice the difference between forgiveness and submission, between peace and complicity, between empathy and self-abandonment. And at that point, everything changes. You forgive, but you do not return. You forgive, but you set distance. You forgive, but you no longer offer the same version of yourself. Many will interpret that as coldness, as if forgiveness only had value when it comes with reconciliation and hugs. But you are no longer available to prove anything to anyone. You know this: forgiveness does not need to be visible, it needs to be true. It is when you realize that forgiving with awareness is not something you give to the other, it is something you give to yourself. You forgive yourself for having endured so much, for having said yes when you wanted to say no, for having accepted crumbs as if they were banquets, for having confused love with emotional addiction. You forgive yourself for not knowing earlier what you know now, for having betrayed yourself in the name of peace, for having believed your pain mattered less than everyone else's. And above all, you forgive yourself for having forgotten your own worth for so long. Jung said the healing process begins when you decide to stop carrying the guilt of others. And for a long time, the empath was a bearer of guilt. Not only did they forgive, they absorbed. Not only did they accept, they took responsibility. Not only did they love, they erased themselves. Forgiving with awareness is giving everyone back their piece of the drama. It is leaving the stage with dignity, even if the other keeps acting. It is choosing inner freedom, even if it costs you external misunderstanding. And at that point, you feel your heart is still good, but now it has borders. It did not harden, it healed. You start loving from a new place, not from emptiness, urgency, or wound, but from fullness. You offer what you have, not what you lack. You care, but you do not cancel yourself. You embrace, but you do not carry. And that, dear empath, is a revolution. It is not the end of sensitivity. It is the beginning of wisdom. As Jung wrote, what you deny submits you. What you accept transforms you. And by accepting your anger, your boundary, your pain, your shadow, you do not become empathetic, you become whole. You begin to forgive with eyes open, with your whole body, with your soul standing tall. And so your forgiveness stops being compulsion and becomes a choice, a gift, an act of power. Not because the other deserves it, but because you deserve to be free. We have reached the end of this journey, but perhaps it is the start of another. A journey that does not begin with a grand decision, but with an inner whisper, that old voice ignored for years, that now speaks firmly. I no longer need to destroy myself to be loved. You watched each mask fall, theirs, yes, but also yours. You saw compassion dressed as submission, forgiveness offered out of fear, love that was silently begging for help. And now something in you has changed. It was not a thunderous change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it is there like a lighter breath, like a discomfort that became a boundary, like a guilt that finally gave way to clarity. Carl Jung said, becoming conscious is a painful process, and it is, because consciousness demands, dismantles, forces us to look exactly where we used to turn away. But it is in that raw, naked gaze that the soul wakes up. You no longer need to be emotionally available 24 hours a day. You do not have to be the good one at all costs. You do not have to carry the world so others will call you strong. You can be good, but with discernment. You can be loving, but with boundaries. You can forgive, but only when your heart is ready, not when your wound is still open. That is the real turning point, when the empath stops being a container for the world's pain and becomes a channel for authentic expression. The world does not need more nice people. It needs whole people. People who look you in the eyes with truth, who feel intensely, who love with presence, and who also know how to say no, how to leave, how to choose themselves. And if you made it here, then maybe you are already on that path, crossing from the old self who forgave out of fear to the new self who forgives with awareness, From the person who pleased to be accepted to the soul that now refuses to betray itself. May you have the courage to keep going, the strength to hold your boundaries even when no one understands, the courage to forgive, yes, but without surrendering your integrity. Because in the end, as Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And you, dear empath, did not come to this world to be a mask. You came to be truth. I clearly remember a night when I sat on the bathroom floor with the light off, my face hot from held-back tears, with one sentence pounding in my head: why is it always you who yields? It was one of those classic situations. Someone had hurt me again, and I, as always, looked inside for a reason to forgive. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe I asked too much. Maybe this is what love means. But that night something broke. It was not an outer rupture. It was a small inner earthquake, silent, final. There in the dark, I understood that my forgiveness was not generosity. It was fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being seen as cruel, fear of no longer being needed. And in that silence between one heavy breath and another, I forgave myself. Not for having yielded so many times, but for believing that loving meant erasing myself. Since then, I have been relearning what it means to be empathetic without being submissive, to love without annihilating myself, to help without sacrificing myself. And I am deeply grateful that you made it to the end. Because if you are here, maybe you too are walking that same dark hallway between the old version of you and the new one being born. And I will tell you with all the truth I have learned, you do not need to break to prove you are whole. You do not need to bow to prove empathy. You can love intensely with boundaries, with awareness, with presence,